Hello there. In this video, we're going to be looking at the project development lifecycle. We're going to start with deploying a project to the server, and then doing some automation of our jobs, and then finally doing some monitoring of those same jobs. So in the previous video, we built this graph, and it works great, but every time that we want to run it, we have to boot up the CloverDX Designer and run it from here. That's kind of tedious, right? Well, we can make things easier on ourselves by putting this project onto the server. Let me show you how to do that. We'll start by right-clicking on our project in the Project Explorer and then selecting Convert to Server Project. When we click that, we'll get this dialog here where it'll ask us for the server URL, username, and password. Obviously, you're going to need access to a Clover server for this. I'm running one on my local host, as you can see here. Maybe you have a work server, or maybe you're running it on localhost as well. But once we've typed in the URL, user, and password, we can click Test Connection, and we should see connection established. Then I'll click Next, and I can use an existing sandbox, or I can create a new sandbox. That's what I'm going to do here. And it'll automatically name it based on what the project was named before, which is Demo. And then I'll click Finish. Notice it's called a sandbox now. Previously we were calling it a project, and now we're calling it a sandbox. Don't get confused. They're the same thing. Sandbox is just the name that we use for it when it's on the server, and project is the name when it's on your local computer. So I'm going to click Finish, and now you'll see this S in the top corner here in the Project Explorer, showing that this is a server project. It'll also have the URL to the server there. Keep in mind that now that we've switched it to a server project, all of the files that were in your project are going to be copied to the server. So if you've got some like really big data sources or something in there, it's going to take a while for those things to get copied over. Just keep that in mind. Mine is pretty simple, so it's already finished. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Clover server. If we right click on our demo here, the project sandbox, and go to CloverDX server, we click that, and it's going to open up in your web browser. The default username and password is Clover and Clover. Make sure you change those before you put it on the production. We'll click login. So this is what the server interface looks like. On the top left here, we've got our Operations tab, which includes monitoring of resources and status history and logs and things. Our execution history, which is this page here, showing the different jobs that I've run recently. You can see I've run the employee loader graph that we created a few times, and I've run this truncate graph to clear my databases. And then there's task history, which we'll talk about when we get to automation. Automation is the topic for later in this video. Keep watching. And then we've got jobs and assets here. So we've got a page for our sandboxes. Then we've got libraries. Libraries are reusable packages of graphs and subgraphs. You can think like the subgraph that we did in the first video, but for content that is really highly reusable. If you go to marketplace.cloverdx.com, you can find a bunch of different libraries that we've got here for working with Amazon, working with BigQuery, Google Drive, etc. Lots of great libraries here providing extra functionality for specific uses. Take a look at those. Then we've got transactional datasets and reference datasets here. I talked briefly about those in our building of the graph video. We're going to get more in depth with those in our business tools video. So then let's go back to sandboxes, right? This is the first one I mentioned here. And when we click on sandboxes, we can see all the different sandboxes that we have on our server. And we can see our demo sandbox that we just created here. And you'll notice it has all the folders that we had in our CloverDX Designer here. And if I follow my graph folder here, I can find my employee loader, and I can see the name and some information about it. But if I click Job Inspector here, And I can see the graph that we built in Designer, right? And so I mentioned that we've moved it to a server project, right? So now our project lives on the server, and any changes we make in the Designer are going to happen here almost immediately. So we've got our graph here. Let me show you something. If I go back to the Designer here, and if I move error handling from underneath of database writer to underneath of the map, and I'm going to save that real quick. Now, immediately I can go back to the server, and when I refresh this, we can see that component's moved from underneath of database writer to underneath of map. So changes happen here almost immediately, which is why we highly recommend you have a development server that you're making your changes on. You're not making changes directly on the production server because changes happen immediately. And if you make a mistake, you've made a mistake. So we've got our graph here, and we can even run the graph directly from the server. It's going to ask me if I want any parameters. I don't right now. I'm just going to click run. And look at that. We've run the job here right on the server. If I go back to my execution history, I can see that I've run that just now, and it looks the same as if we ran it from the Designer, but we've run it now from the server. So that's pretty cool. But we're still doing it manually, right? I don't have to boot up the Designer every time I want to run it from the server, but it's still kind of tedious to have to do it manually. It'd be so much nicer if I could automate it and not have to worry about it every time, right? So let's take a look at automation. So there's 3 ways we can handle automation with CloverDX Server. The first is the most straightforward. It's schedules. I can click new schedule here, and I can set the graph or job flow or something to run on whatever interval I want it to, right? So if I call this employee loader schedule, I can select whether I want it to be interval or one time or on a timetable, and I can tell it to run every hour here, right? Every 60 minutes, starting now, going to forever. You can select which user it's going to run under, and then down here, task type, start a job flow, start a graph, and select sandbox, my demo sandbox, and we'll select employee loader here, right? So now every hour, it's going to run our employee loader. You can select whatever variable schedule you want here, starting when, ending when, etc. So if I click create, now I've got my schedule here, employee loader schedule. You'll notice Clover has some default ones here to clean up old files, artifacts, and things. And if I go to my execution history, I can see here that we've just run it. When we created it, we told it to run now. And I can see that employee loader.graph was run through the employee loader schedule. Great. So schedules, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. I'm going to skip over data services real quick and go to event listeners. Event listeners are also pretty straightforward. Instead of running on a schedule, they're listening for some event to happen, right? So if I click on new listener, I can see we've got lots of options here. Let's look at the first ones, job flow and graph listener. With these, Clover server is going to listen for whatever graph or job flow you tell it to listen for. Let's pick our graph that we made, graph employee loader.graph. And now I can tell it what to listen for with this graph, for when the graph finishes, when the graph starts, if there's an error, timeout, aborted, etc. Let's say we want, when the graph finishes, we want to trigger a task, right? What task can we do? We can start a new graph or start a job flow. Let's say we want to send an email to HR to tell them, hey, we've loaded the employees, right? So now every time this graph runs, every time the graph finishes, then an email will be sent to HR saying, hey, employees have been loaded, employees have been loaded. Or we could, instead of doing our error handling within the graph itself, we could say, hey, listen for an error with the employee loader. And anytime there's an error, start this graph and do XYZ, right? The possibilities are endless. You can listen for anything to happen within a graph, and then you can do, with execute shell command, you can do, just about anything. So that is job flow listener and graph listener, right? We'll talk about job flows in the next video. For now, think of them as being very similar to graphs. Then the next is a file listener, where we can have it listen for new files to arrive in a folder. So it can be your local file system or SFTP, Azure Blob Storage, whatever. Lots of different places where it can be listening for. And then when a new file shows up, it'll do what we tell it to do, right? So we can start a graph. Let's say every time HR uploads a new file to a certain folder, the graph is going to run with that file. Just pretty straightforward. It's just always listening for that, or it's checking every 60 seconds or whatever you set it for there. And then we've got JMS message and Kafka message listeners. So for those different connectors that you can use, it'll be listening and searching for the data there. And then we've got a universal listener where you can write your own Groovy code to look for whatever, universal, right? You can do just about anything there. And then we've even got a task failure listener here, which is going to listen to all the other listeners, basically. And when they fail, do what you tell it to do, right? Say your file listener is listening for an Amazon bucket, and this task failure listener is listening to that. And so if the connection is broken at some point, or if your password expires or whatever, this will let you know, hey, the file listener isn't working anymore. So it's a listener. And that goes back to earlier, I mentioned task history here, where this is where I can see the different automation tasks that have happened, right? So we earlier ran our employee loader schedule here. And so this shows us the different tasks that we've set through our automations. So that's event listeners. Now let's talk about data services. Data services are basically custom API endpoints that we can create so that your Clover graphs and job flows, etc., can be accessed via API endpoints. If you click on data services, you'll see something that looks like this. There's no published data service jobs because we haven't created any yet. So let's go back to Designer and look at how we would do that. So I've got here my nice, beautiful graph. If I right click over here on Graph Employee Loader, I can see here Convert Graph to Data Service. So when I click on that, it's going to ask me where I want to save it. Usually the default is going to be this Data Service folder. And then it's going to have a file name, Employee Loader, instead of .grf, Employee Loader.rjob for REST job, for REST API. So if I click Finish, now it's created this. It looks basically the same, except it has these two bars on the left and right, okay, showing different input that I can accept from the API and output, okay? So I'm going to, just for fun here, I'm going to disable this error handling subgraph, and I'm going to connect that. I'll draw it down here just so you can see the line going. I'm going to connect those records where we don't have any emergency contacts and send those to the output of our REST job, right? So again, this looks pretty much the same, except now we've got our output going somewhere different. If I go to Endpoint Configuration tab here, and I'm going to click, you notice here on the right it says REST job is not published. I'm going to click Publish. Save changes. Yeah, it needs to save before. So save changes and publish. Now REST job is published. Cool. And I have this URL here. Okay, endpoint URL. So now this is just a simple GET request. If I copy this and take it back to my Google Chrome and run it, now you can see I've run my job by using the URL, the endpoint URL, and the output here is these 7 records with no emergency contact. So you can see it's really simple to have your data from a job you've already built outputted into an API really easily. If we go back to data services, we can see here now we've got our one data service. We can see that it was run once with OK, never failed. We just ran it that one time. And then you can see some important information about it here, the state and history, any alerts. So right now it's just returning this JSON here, which for technical users might be perfectly fine, might be all you want. Because you're going to process this data in some other app or something. But if we want to make it a little bit more readable, a little bit more friendly for our non-technical users, we can create what's called a data app here. And so we can create a much more user-friendly interface for those non-technical users to work with the data. Let's go back to our designer here where I can look at my endpoint configuration and do some, add some extra features here. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a category here called human resources. All right. And then I can give it even an icon so that they have something visual to see and click on it. So I've got this employees PNG icon here. And the last change I'm going to make is I'm going to change the output from JSON to CSV to make it a little bit more readable for our users. So, and then I'm going to save all that and then go back to the data services here where I will click this tab to enable a data app. Okay. So now our users will have something that they can click on from the Business Tools homepage, right? So you can find that at your server URL /Clover/home. It'll find this Welcome to CloverDX Business Tools page where they can click on Data Apps. And you'll see here, we've got our Human Resources category here. If we had more apps, they would be sorted based on the categories that we've given them. And you can find our employee loader here with our description and the icon that we just added, this little employee badge. And now all they've got to do is click on the app. And for this one, there's no parameters or anything, so they'll just run app. And then they'll be returned the 7 users who didn't have emergency contacts in this nice readable sort of spreadsheet looking thing. And they can even download the CSV file right here. So that was a pretty simple data app where all the user does is click run. But if we wanted to, we could make it a little more complex. I've got here an example one where we can give them different inputs that they can do, right? So here's a string, integer. We can give them a date selection bar, a simple Boolean, true or false, or even adding files, right? We could have them input a text file that is used to process in the graph. Whatever we can imagine, whatever data we might need from them, we can give it to them here. And this is fully customizable. You can change everything to match your company colors and styles, and this is all fully customizable. I'm just showing you simple examples here. So that's data apps and data services. So you can see we can automate your data flow with simple schedules or event listeners, or as complex as creating API endpoints that can be accessed either through your third-party apps or through our data apps right here in Clover for your non-technical users to use. So And then finally, we'll talk about monitoring here. You can monitor your jobs through this execution history where you can see when they've run, what the status of the run is, etc. Same thing with task history for your automation tasks to see how they're running. And then finally, if you are trying to monitor through some third-party app or something you don't want to log into our server interface, you can totally find here from the homepage the REST API catalog, where you can see everything within the server is accessible through an API. So you can easily use this to monitor everything that's going on within your Clover server. That's the project development lifecycle, from adding it to the server to automating it and monitoring it. In the next video, we'll show you how to go a little step more complex than our simple graphs into what we call orchestration and job flows. Thanks.